All right, Mr. Sapora here. Okay, I am going to go over the plankton lecture for marine biology notes. And I am just clicking through to bring up my screen so you can kind of see the presentation as we go along here. All right, looks like we are up and running. Okay, great. Yes, excellent. Okay, so let's talk about plankton. The presentation is linked. I have that link for you up there with the weekly questions. And so there's a few hyperlinks embedded in here, such as this one right here, Start of the Ocean Food Web, links to about a 5-minute little video that's really cool with some great graphics. And you should click that and check that out, talking about the life of plankton. So what is plankton? Okay, plankton comes from the Greek term planktos, meaning a wanderer or drifter. And what we're really thinking about here then is organisms, tiny things, generally tiny. Sometimes they can be big like a jellyfish, but generally small things that cannot move against the water current. So they can't swim actively against the current and kind of move in an opposite direction. They can swim around in the current, but they can't just go against it, such as larger things like fishes and whales, and etc. I'd say the majority of ocean organisms spend part of their life as plankton, and this differs from another term that we would then use called nekton. Nekton would be those larger organisms that are stronger that can actively swim against the current. Okay. So that's definitionally what plankton is. And again, generally we're talking about microscopic things that are hard to see with just your eye. Normally we would do a lab where we would look at under microscopes for a couple days. Sorry, I'm going to have to leave that one out. But you can see here kind of some of the different things that we'd be looking at if we did look under a microscope. And actually this image right here is a great representation of things that we see commonly just here in our water. The tinier things that you're seeing here, the little chains of things, these are diatoms, and these are photosynthetic kind of forms of algae almost that we'll be talking about here in a minute. And then the larger ones here with the little antenna, these are copepods, probably the most numerous animal on the planet. And then, of course, you've got things like nekton over here, this giant basking shark, and these things are plankton eaters as well. The largest things in the world are plankton eaters, including whales, because there's so much plankton out there. All right, next slide. So again, it is the start of the ocean food web. Okay, great. So two different types of plankton that we can classify plankton into, I guess, would be the way to look at it. Holoplankton are organisms that spend their whole entire life as plankton. So every stage of their life cycle, they're plankton. And things you can think about there, holoplankton, jellyfish. On the big scale, they're plankton their whole life. Copepods, some of these little shrimp and krill, of course, photosynthetic algae and things like that, like diatoms that are single-celled, are plankton their whole life. Meroplankton are organisms that just spend part of their life as plankton. So usually it's like a larval stage, and there's a whole ton of organisms that do this in the ocean. In fact, most things that we think about or that we see kind of attached to rocks have a life cycle where they're free floating as plankton when they're younger. Mussels, clams, sea anemones, starfish, sea stars, all these other things have planktonic stages when they're young, juvenile larval forms. And for meroplankton, here kind of a cool little chart that I found that shows some of the different stages. Interestingly enough, I just noticed there's a flaw in here. Anyway, I'll bring that up in a second, see if you could figure out what it is. The common starfish, here we go, big old starfish you can find in a tide pool. This is what it looks like as a planktonic stage. Crab have a plankton stage as well when they're larval juveniles, so they float around in the ocean and then they eventually morph and grow into larger form. And then we got the mantis shrimp here. Octopus have a planktonic stage as well. They're really cute looking. We've seen those in our class. Sea urchins. This is a sea urchin right up here, right? Huh? Yeah, exactly. They have a plankton stage. And then worms and other things like that. So most of your invertebrates, things without backbones, have a planktonic stage. The one thing that I would say that is not meroplankton here would be the moon jelly. I think this is wrong. Yes, it has a planktonic stage that's different from the adult, but both are actually still plankton. Anyway, That's me being picky. Okay. So at the very base of the ocean food web, at the base of any food web, are your primary producers, right? Your things that do some sort of synthesis of non-organic material into organic material. Generally, we think of this as photosynthesis because that's the majority of biological synthesis that goes on here on planet Earth. There are those weird little chemoautotrophs, we call them, and they do like synthesis down in the bottom of the ocean with using chemicals from hydrothermal vents. Anyway, we're talking about phytoplankton here, and these are photosynthetic, small autotrophs, primary producers, and they sit at the bottom of the ocean food web. They are the base of the ocean food web. They are the forest, the grass, the savanna of the sea, so to speak. And I have a link here, so I'm curious to see where this will take us. Probably, oh, here's just some different images, all the different images of phytoplankton. They're really, really cool and beautiful looking. Many of them have these really elaborate cell walls that they make. They're single-celled still, but they have these cell walls made of glass or cellulose, and depending on the type of phytoplankton that you're looking at, and microscopically they just cloud up the ocean, and you can see big blooms of them from space. You can see that here. And they also make our red tide in the summertime here as well, the dinoflagellates. Get so many of those. Okay, bring this back up. Cool. Again, usually too small to be seen with the naked eye. No duh. Holoplankton. I mean, they spend their whole life as plankton. Okay. Zooplankton are the other type of plankton that we could be talking about, and they generally consist of animals belonging to the animal kingdom, such as crustaceans, shrimps, jellyfish, things of that nature, and all the different larval stages, and then protists, which would be sort of single-celled heterotrophs, consumers, things that do not do photosynthesis, but that eat things. There's a whole host of those too. Zooplankton range in size from microscopic up to jellyfish, which you can see, and they consist of both marrow and holoplankton. So there are those things that just spend part of their life as zooplankton, the larval stages of sea anemones and crabs and various other organisms, and then they later go on to become non-plankton, where they settle on the bottom of the ocean. So if you're not drifting in the ocean, you're not plankton, right? You're attached to the bottom. That's another type of organism we'll talk about later, called benthic, in case you were wondering. Okay, and here's just a image showing some of the zooplankton that we have off of the Oregon coast here. Some pretty cool drawings. Again, fish larvae, barnacles spend part of their life as plankton before they anchor onto rocks. Copepods spend their hololife as plankton before they're holoplankton. Here's another copepod there. Here's a crab larva. And amphipods are similar to shrimp. They're actually roly-polies are a type of amphipod on land. Euphasids are another one sort of similar to shrimp as well. Okay, moving along. Let's talk about phytoplankton. There's a hyperlink here to a video I have, and you can check that out. Looks like there's a section on phytoplankton that starts at minute 16, second 30 there. So you can advance to that. I believe this is the Planet Ocean video. It's a really cool documentary. You should watch the whole thing, right? You're stuck at home, might as well. Okay. Phytoplankton are generally single-celled autotrophs, meaning that they do make their own food, and they are the start, again, of every ocean food chain. It's more important than just saying they're the start of the ocean food chain. Really think of them as being those primary producers that make glucose, that make sugar, that take the inorganic carbon dioxide and water and turn it into the organic C6H12O6. Know your Cho. What's up, Cho? Oh, Cho. Okay. And they do this through photosynthesis. Boom. And as a byproduct to making all of this sugar, right, and food for themselves, they give off a lot of oxygen. About half the Earth's oxygen is given off and exhaled by these organisms as they're making sugar. This little map down here, do I have it blown up on the next slide? Let me see. Woohoo! Why here? Okay. Why do we see them in the places that we see them? Why do we see these primary producers? And I'm going to have to back that up then. Hang on just a second. Why do we see them in the zones we see them? If you're looking at this map down here, the highest concentrations of photosynthetic organisms are in red, the lowest concentrations are in purple. So what's weird is that the middle sections of the ocean, right, both in the North Pacific and the South Pacific, these sort of areas that correspond to high pressure, dry air. This is the Tropic of Cancer, this is the Tropic of Capricorn, are dead zones in the ocean. And they're kind of dead zones in the ocean because there's really no wind there, and so there's nothing to carry nutrients from land out into the ocean. So there's no currents ripping through here. Now there's a huge current that rips along the equator right in here. And this is what gives us our trade winds or our easterly winds as well. And there's a constant jet stream of air just kind of flowing down along the equator, and it pushes nutrients from the land, from the Congo in here, and then of course from Ecuador, basically in here, out across the ocean. And that supplies this plankton with nutrients, fine little minerals and things like that from soil. Out here, there are no nutrients because there's no wind, and the ocean's 12,000 feet deep, and so there's this disconnect between the light and the actual nutrients below, so there's not much mixing in these areas. The Southern Ocean, and of course up north in North Pacific, Atlantic, and the Arctic are the most productive oceans in the world. And that is seasonal, of course, but in the summertime they get 24 hours of light, a lot of wind mixing the water with nutrients, and especially in the north, it's very shallow because of the proximity to land. So there's this constant nutrient mixing, 24 hours of light. Cold water actually holds more oxygen, and it's much more productive in these oceans. And it's why whales, birds, and so many other things migrate to these regions. That's why salmon leave our rivers and head up to Alaska to grow big, because there's just so much food that gets produced up there seasonally that then other organisms take advantage of that. Cool beans. So why here? I think I just answered that. Okay, next up. So what is it that controls why we see phytoplankton where we do? Again, back to this map here showing the why here. Why do we see them in the north and in the south, along the equator, and then really abundantly along coastlines all around the planet? One of the reasons that we see plankton where we do is light, right? So if you're doing photosynthesis, you need the photo part to do the synthesis. Okay, so light only reaches the upper 200 meters of the ocean in the photic zone. Below that 200-meter depth, it's 99% of all light is gone. It's what we call the aphotic zone, and so light doesn't penetrate. And this graphic here kind of shows what types of light and penetrate and to what depth, right? A red light is penetrates the shallowest, only about 10 meters, 30 feet, and it's gone. But your blue light tends to penetrate the deepest, and that's why we see the ocean as blue, coincidentally. 90% of all marine life is in this upper 200 meters then. This up in here is the photic zone. This is where photosynthesis is happening. Below this, no photosynthesis, so not much life at all. And the second thing that controls or limits where phytoplankton can occur or does occur in abundance is nutrients, right? So you've got light penetrating the surface of the ocean, the upper area. But then those nutrients, right, the major ingredients that these things need to produce their cells and produce their bodies and make more DNA and blah, 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 are nitrates, right? Nitrogen containing molecules and then phosphates as well. And these things derive and come from land and rock and rivers, right? Rivers carry these things out. The wind blows them off of continents and they sort of pepper the ocean waters near shore, and then currents will carry them further out. If you're in a shallow ocean or where two plates may converge, and there's this thing called upwelling, we'll talk about that later, that can mix nutrients up. So along the margins of continents, where it goes from very deep to relatively shallow pretty quickly, the ocean currents will hit that shelf and then bring up all these nutrients into that photic zone. So if you've got nutrients mixing in the photic zone, oh, here, I have an upwelling graphic right here. This is a perfect combination for productivity. And this upwelling zone off of our particular coastline is about 100 miles out offshore, and so right in there you're going to get a lot of sea life and marine life, and this is where a lot of people go out to fish as well, because that's where a ton of stuff is going on. Okay, source for these nutrients is mainly runoff from land, and Yeah, these nutrients are used up in this upper 200 meters. So as they're carried away from land, as you can kind of see in this graphic here, they get used up in photosynthesis. And the farther out we get, right, the more used up they get. And so eventually they're either consumed or they end up just settling and sinking down below the photozone. So, 12,000 feet deep, there's actually quite a bit of nutrients down in there. But no sunlight, so nothing can use those nutrients to grow. It's like having a bag of fertilizer in your basement. There's that map, nice and big. Okay, so yeah, you can see along the margins of continents, a lot of photosynthesis. The mouth of the Amazon River right here, mouths of major rivers, mouth of the Mississippi right in here are going to be really productive areas as well. And then, yeah, I'm going to keep moving here so we can get through this. Okay. Yeah, I'm not really going to explain these graphics too much right now. Mainly this one here I'll take a look at. The production of phytoplankton, the highest time of productivity would be in the spring as sunlight increases. The phytoplankton production starts to increase as well, and then really starts to peak, right about now, actually, out in the ocean, where we're in April here. But zooplankton isn't a curve that sits right on top of that, right? Because it responds to that. So the phytoplankton peaks, and then as it is increasing, the zooplankton's feeding on it and reproducing, but their peak is a little bit after that peak of the phytoplankton as well, more in June. Is when you'd see the highest numbers of zooplankton in the oceans. Okay. Types of phytoplankton. We're almost done here. There's two types of phytoplankton that I want you to know about, the most abundant ones in the ocean. The first ones are diatoms. These are actual images of diatoms. They are incredible looking. They are unicellular, meaning they're single-celled, and they reproduce asexually. There is some forms of sexual reproduction here with these guys that will help increase genetic variations. But the main thing is genetic diversity. The main thing is that they can reproduce asexually, so they can respond really rapidly to increases in light or food or nutrients and things like that. And their numbers can grow quickly. They're incredibly tiny, right? So they're 50 to 500 micrometers. Again, if we had microscopes, we could zoom in on these things and take a look. But basically, you can fit 1,000 micrometers on a single millimeter. So if you look at a ruler and see how big a millimeter is, picture fitting 1,000 micrometers across there. All right. And just like plants, they contain chloroplasts, which are the things that do photosynthesis. Plants on land evolved from these things in the ocean, right? These diatoms and then algae that came later. The cell wall of a diatom is called a frustule. It's just a weird sounding word. And it's made of silica. It's made of quartz. It's made of glass, basically. And because it's made of quartz and glass, this is their little effort to not be eaten, basically. It's their defense. Because it's made of glass, they fossilize really well. And they have these really cool patterns that you can see under microscopes. And each species or each group has a unique set of characteristics and patterns, and there's just an abundance of them out there in the world, and we can look back in the fossil record as well and find these throughout marine layers that go back hundreds of millions of years. Okay, pelagic forms, meaning ones that are kind of free-floating, planktonic in the ocean. Those tend to be more circular or triangular. And then benthic forms. By benthic, we mean existing on the bottom. So these would be in shallow waters where light touches the bottom, bays, estuaries, near shore. Those ones tend to be more linear and elongated, and they kind of spike themselves into the mud and kind of stick up and gather sunlight. It's like a microscopic garden of grass that you can't really see, which is kind of cool to think about that's out there. Cool fact. They're 100 micrometers in a millimeter. I don't know why I put that there because they're 1,000. Anyway, I make this presentation late, and it is late, so whatevs. Yeah. All right, I need to go and fix that. There we go. So you can kind of see the size of these things as well in relation here on the micrometer scale. Okay. The other type of phytoplankton we're going to talk about are dinoflagellates. They also are unicellular, meaning they're single-celled. They're called dinoflagellates. The di refers to the two part, and then flagella. So these are kind of like little whips that they can move with through the water. It's kind of cool. Actually, they tend to move with the rear one, and the two on top kind of give them buoyancy to keep them from sinking, which is kind of cool to think about. It kind of spreads out the surface area and lets them float. They also reproduce asexually, and again, very tiny as well. 25 to 1,000 micrometers in size. They can be large. They have the two flagella for movement, and again for flotation as well. And the cell wall of these guys is made of cellulose, so not the silica that you'd see in the diatoms. And the cell wall is kind of rougher on these. It isn't quite as ornate or polished, but they have these little spikes and horns. And again, it's a form of armor to try and keep them from being eaten. They contain many small chloroplasts, just like the diatoms, like plants do as well, allow them to do photosynthesis. And because they reproduce asexually, they can reproduce really rapidly in good growing conditions. So here, this time of year, right now, is starting to be peak time for plankton. Days are getting longer, weather's getting nicer, and they're responding to that rapidly. So where in the winter time you could go out and go scuba diving here and you could see 30, 40, 50, 60 feet maybe in the water, underwater with a mask on. It'd be that clear. There may be just 10 or 20 of these guys per liter of water. A liter of water is like an Nalgene bottle. But ramp up to now in about April, the water gets so cloudy you can barely see your hand out in front of your face, and that's because there's more than 1 million of these per liter of water, and they reproduce really fast and rapidly. They call them blooms because they'll go from 1 to 1 million in a matter per liter in a matter of a month or so, and they often give the water this sort of red burgundy color, and they call it red tide as a result of that. There gets to be so many in the water. They produce toxins as a waste product. Domoic acid is one of the byproducts that they produce just through their general metabolism. It's not a problem when there's only a few in the water, but when there's 1 million per liter in the water, it does become a problem. That domoic acid that they're kind of giving off as like a waste product, almost like they're peeing it out, gets really concentrated in the ocean water, and then things that are filter feeders in the ocean, such as clams, or even things like crabs that pull in a lot of water through their gills, will get a buildup of this in their body tissue, and they become toxic to us to eat. So that's why we have these shellfish closures, things like that on the Oregon coast. In response to that, because they got so much of this built up in them. And then again, we'll be able to eat them again in the winter. So usually in the summer months, spring to summer, we avoid eating things like clams and mussels on the coast. They also produce this bioluminescence, meaning that they kind of get this glowy thing at night, kind of like a firefly. And they have a protein that they produce called luciferin, kind of funny, and it gets oxidized with this specific enzyme called luciferase, and it lights up. It creates light. And let me see if I have a picture of that here. I sure do. So here's kind of a little bit of a time-lapsey shot of this bioluminescence. If you've ever been out on the beach at nighttime walking here, check it out. We're coming into the red tide months, so especially in May and June, sometimes you'll be able to see this if you just kind of watch the waves roll in, and if you walk right as the wave is washing out, your feet kind of contacting it will cause it to oxidize, and you'll see this light. It's kind of cool. Ooh, look at, there's someone's hand moving through it. Ooh. Okay, zooplankton. We got our heterotrophic consumers. These are the things that consume or eat the phytoplankton, the next level up in the old energy pyramid food web. This is a huge group of organisms, extremely diverse. We've got larval, adult forms of you know, just pretty much everything in the ocean, but really at some point is plankton. It seems like in many things are plankton their whole lives. When we think of zooplankton, we tend to think of things like shrimp, euphasids here, or copepods with their little antennas and things like that. But there are also things, like I said, larval crab, larval clams, larval worms, larval everything. Okay. The most important group would be these copepods. Again, they're a type of a crustacean, so they're in the group Arthropoda, which is the largest group of animals on the planet. It includes insects and arachnids and millipedes and dragonflies and crustaceans. Crustaceans are crabs and shrimps and all these other things as well. It's a huge, huge, huge diverse group. 80% of all planet animals are arthropods, and a chunk of that are crustaceans. But just pure abundance, pure numbers, copepods, they're more numerous than any other type of animal on the planet. They're everywhere in the oceans because they're small. So, yeah, 1 to 3 millimeters in size. You can kind of see them moving in the water, but you can't really tell what it is unless you have a microscope. They swim weakly and jerkily. They use their little antenna to float, and again, to help give them buoyancy. Again, large antennas slow their rate of sinking, and that's the same as with dinoflagellates we were just talking about. They graze and feed on phytoplankton, and they provide a link between that phytoplankton and the larger carnivores. So the things that eat the copepods maybe don't necessarily eat the phytoplankton. So if the copepods weren't there, pretty much life in the ocean would kind of stop. They are that link between those super, microscopic phytoplankton and other things as well. Here's a picture of one moving jerkily through the water using their antenna. La. Okay, wonderful. Oh, look, there's another one. What a jerk. Dude, am I done? Are we done? I think we are. All right, well, that was our lecture on plankton, and I hope you enjoyed it. Read the textbook. There's the pages. Review those pages and fill out your weekly questions. Next week, we'll be talking about vertebrates. That's all I got. Now I just got to figure out how to exit out of here. How long was this thing? And stop recording. Later.